So, before we picture these sophisticated white marble city-states like Athens, Thebes, and Corinth, we must imagine ancient Italy and ancient Greece as containing thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of these micro-societies and polities we call families or gens, which, as we've seen, were a clan-like social structure constituted by the religion of inherited gods, and thus instituted as a religious hierarchical community consisting of clients, secondary branches, and a main or senior branch, all under the absolute authority of a paterfamilias, or ecodespotis, as a king in practice. This could have been the case of the Greco-Italian world for centuries, roughly from around 2000 BC to 1000 BC, and even much later in some other places. Let's remember Rome was officially founded as a city-state in the year 753 BC, whereas Athens is much older. Most of the early history of the West, from the Indo-European migrations and settlement until the appearance of the city-states, consisted in this period of isolated clans, from which we have very few written sources. And perhaps it could have stayed that way, a world fragmented into a great number of isolated families, each of these clan-like associations with its own gods and private law. However, it didn't. Humans are social animals and work through cooperation thanks to belief in common fictions. To have so many isolated human microcosmos is only possible when the demographic pressures over these social structures to open up are low, and the incentives of interacting with other human associations aren't that attractive. But in the ancient West, the mere fact that population grew over time made it virtually impossible for isolation to be kept on forever, at least for people living in largely connected landmasses like Afro-Eurasia. In an agrarian reality, when populations grow, this creates two main demographic pressures on existing social structures. Firstly, trade happens. When human associations grow, they demand and produce more goods and services. This means they get richer and have more complex consumption needs, beyond mere survival, and more surplus to trade with. So, economic growth in agrarian isolated societies starts to push them to trade between each other, further uniting them, because trade is arguably one of the best tools to tear down divisions amongst human beings. Secondly, war and international relations happen, because when these associations grow in population size, they also gain more military and political power. And in turn, they demand more resources to feed this growing apparatus, which in pre-industrial terms means acquiring more land and more population, which causes them in turn to find themselves in conflict with other human associations competing for those same scarce resources. These conflicts often lead to conquest, peace treaties, and alliances between them, namely political subjugation and/or unification, in the context of competition for the exercise of power and the quest for well-being. So, either by trade, war, or diplomacy, human associations start to collide against each other, which may create, in turn, bigger, broader human institutions, because some societies either consume the weaker and smaller ones, or because they create federations with the equally stronger, because the incentives of conquest not always surpass those of mutually associating by trade or diplomatic means. Roughly in the 1,000 years before the peak of the Bronze Age cultures, it began to happen, a gradual process of unification of these clans into broader forms of association by the pressures of changing demographics. During the peak of the Bronze Age, there were several polities like Mycenae, which accumulated and exercised a considerable amount of power, and back then, the roots of Western civilization seemed to go in an upward spiral, perhaps even with possibilities to compete with Eastern polities such as the Hittites or Egypt's New Kingdom. It didn't happen, because the Bronze Age Greek, Egyptian, and Levantine worlds collapsed. After the Bronze Age collapse came the Greek Dark Ages, which probably saw a dramatic reduction in population sizes, and thus in trade, war, and cultural activity. There was likely a reversion to isolated clan life. City-states began to reappear again in the Mediterranean in the late Dark Ages, and with a faster pace in what is known as the Archaic period, starting in the 8th century BC, a period characterized by a faster rate of population growth and thus economic recovery, reversing the long decline of the Dark Ages. In the coming centuries, city-states became the most prominent form of human association in Greece and Italy, from the late Archaic period in the 6th century BC all the way to the Roman conquest of the Mediterranean basin. With this chronological framework, we shall now examine how city-states were born, out of a tribal world of clans and families, which belief systems constituted them, and which were the subsequent institutions they produced. When these isolated families came into contact, whether it be violent or peaceful, some gens could enlarge themselves by conquering and assimilating other entities, or by sharing common institutions with them through trade or political union. This is how new associations such as the Greek phratries and Roman curiae and tribes were born, by uniting two or more gens into a common belief system that could constitute them as a single group. Of course, the domestic religion of each family was preserved, but the newly shared elements of these ancestral cults became the constitution of these phratries and tribes, that is, by sharing common gods, while each family zealously preserved their own. Ancestral religion was the most powerful available resource for constituting a common belief system, in terms of the legitimacy it could provide. Now, polytheism allows people to continue worshipping their own gods while sharing other gods with others. This is exactly what happened. As groups came into contact, merged, or allied, they established common deities and a common Vesta, to which they could pray and agree on the basic constitution of this larger federative association. This evolution was concurrent with a widening of the religious idea, coming from exclusive family gods that only served those in a particular clan, to more universal ways of understanding the divine. These phratries, curiae, and tribes were modeled upon the family, because they were born by establishing a common cult with the people from many different gens, who, aside from their own family religion, also participated in these larger religious associations. As such, this grouping of peoples imitated the archaic family and its domestic cult. They had a chief, mirroring the paterfamilias, in Latin called tribunus, in Greek philobasileus. Private law, ancestral gods, religious feasts, and a sacred fire. What this meant is that as the population grew, the family in its primitive form stopped being the only societal structure, and the ancient Western world began to walk towards bigger institutions. Homer speaks about the concept of the tribe with the Greek word phile, and tells us about how you could decompose a whole society into these tribes. In Book 2 of the Illiad, "Separate thy man by tribes, by clans, Agamemnon, that clan may bear aid to clan, and tribe to tribe. If thou do this, and the Achaeans obey thee, thou wilt know then who among thy captains is a coward, and who among thy men, and who too is brave, for they will fight each clan for itself." Cicero, Dionysius of Halicarnassus, Dion Cassius, and Aristotle, amongst others, also give descriptions of how phratries, tribes, and curiae, and possibly also the Ovae in Sparta, worked as a merger of many families in Rome and most of Greece. Dionysius of Halicarnassus and Dion Cassius even use the Greek word phratry and the Latin curiae interchangeably in their written accounts. So we know we're dealing with a very similar institutional development in both Greece and Italy. This widening of the religious idea was also possible due to the cult of the gods of physical nature, which were born when society was reduced to isolated families, but progressed towards universalization with more ease than the domestic religion, and thus were useful to enhance cooperation in the context of wider human associations such as tribes and cities. The worship of the gods of physical nature was not born out of the idea of a single universal deity, as it would later come to be, but rather in the individual imagination of people, and also initially within the limits of the family as the only known form of society. It is likely that, in their origin, these gods were linked to a particular family which other families later adopted as a sign of fortune or reverence. As it came to be, it's much easier to share a Jupiter or a Dionysius than one's own great-great-grandfather. However, because they were much more open to all, their traditions and cult elements were much less rigid than the cult of the ancestors and heroes. There was no single dogma or cult, but many cults to many gods with many different names. There could be hundreds or thousands of Jupiters and Zeus, each belonging to a different city, tribe, or family. And so, these deities were gradually made common to larger human groups, They evolved inside the family as a kela, besides the sacred fire, but eventually they left the family's house to have a bigger temple for themselves, in which the sacred fire was no longer the god, but part of the altar of the god, often represented as an anthropomorphic statue, and auxiliary in its sacrifices and prayers. This was the first trend of archaic globalization of religious beliefs in Greece and Italy, and we can see this in temples such as the ones we find in Agrigento, Sicily. We have phratries, curiae, and tribes. So how do we end up with a culture made up of thousands of city-states in the Greco-Italian world across the Mediterranean? Well, as had been the case with phratries and tribes coming from families, city-states were constituted as a confederation of smaller and often pre-existing societies, namely families, phratries, and tribes, initially with high degrees of civil and religious autonomy, yet bound to a common federative cult and government. Ancient Greek and Italian city-states were not born as a big circle, swallowing everything into a unitary and centralized state, but rather as federal unions made up of smaller autonomous clans. This comes as evident in the foundational story of Athens, by what we know of the stories of Cecrops and Theseus, who allegedly fought to institute a common government in Attica, while at the same time carefully refraining from destroying the internal law and religion of each local phratry or family, which also fought for the preservation of their own prerogatives. We can picture Bronze Age Attica, for instance, as a compound of independent phratries, each with their own chief, government, and religion, which, through incentive or submission, joined the Athenian city-state and began to share a common religion and a common government, which, albeit, had little capability of intromission inside its federated entities. We will later see that this way of constituting the city as a federation brought in many conflicts between the central power, which favored a monarchy, and the local aristocracy of the family chiefs, which favored a republic. Cecrops is said to have reigned in the 16th century BC, and only over one of the 12 phratries in which the inhabitants of Attica had converged. With time, the rock of the descendants of Cecrops, the Cecropids, where the altar of Athena Polias had existed, gained more importance. This rock of Cecrops is nothing other than the Acropolis of the city, which took its name from the goddess Athena, Athens. From the royal family of the Cecropids came Theseus, who fought the local clans so that the sacred fire of Athena Polias, that of Athens, could become the religious center of Attica. This eventually happened, and even if each local clan kept their cult, they also accepted a common central religious bondage, which cemented the birth of Athens as a city-state. From the biography of Theseus, written by Plutarch. After the death of Aegeus, Theseus conceived a wonderful design, and settled all the residents of Attica in one city, thus making one people of one city, out of those who up to that time had been scattered about, and were not easily called together for the common interests of all. Accordingly, after doing away with the town halls and council chambers and magistracies in the several communities, and after building a common town hall and council chamber for all on the ground where the upper town of the present day stands, he named the city Athens and instituted a Panathenaic festival. This is also the case in Rome. So, city-states were a federation of pre-existing societies, not individuals. Society for the Greeks and Romans progressed as a confederation of smaller societies that joined together through accord or submission to form the city-state. Everything inside this city came to be segmented into the smaller associations of families and tribes, the army, the assembled people, and the civic cult. Not all cities went through the same progression of the confederation of clans and tribes federating into a single polity. Sometimes the founder of a new city would divide the settlers into tribes and phratries. The main point is that the earliest known form of the Western city-state was understood to exist as a federation of smaller states. So profound was this subdivision of the city that Plato repeatedly speaks about it in his political philosophy as the best way to organize society, in his dialogue, The Laws. Let us choose that which contains the most numerous and most consecutive subdivisions. Number as a whole comprises every division for all purposes, whereas the number 5040 for purposes of war, and in peace for all purposes connected with contributions and distributions, will admit of division into no more than 59 sections, these being consecutive from 1 up to 10. Rome was not built in a day, or was it? While the primitive city was conceived as a political federation, a town was the physical place for living and worshipping. For the ancients, town isn't equivalent to city, although hosting a city gave a town the constitutional architecture it needed to exist. The foundation of the town was therefore a religious act, one that could be done in a single day, just like the stories we know about the foundation of Rome. The foundation rites of Rome had demanded that the founder, Romulus, throw some earth from his homeland, the city of Alba, into a pit, and on top of it establish a vesta. With these elements, the place was now his patria. These references to Rome's foundation ceremony were probably used in many cities before and after Rome. Men, through their religious foundational ceremony, wanted to establish an alliance with the gods, to attract them, to invite them, so they would literally come and live in the city. The town was the city's holy sanctuary, and citizens were compelled to remain there and defend it, just like when the dictator Marcus Furius Camillus advocated for the Roman people in staying inside a devastated Rome after the Gallic invasion by appealing to its divine designation as the home of the Roman gods. By analogy, in the context of a family, wanting to abandon the house, which was the physical temple containing the remains and tombs of the ancestors and the Vesta, would have been utterly unthinkable. Well, the city, as we can see, mirrors the family in most of its institutions. The founder of a city like Romulus and Ennius were carriers of the gods, priests while alive and worshipped ancestors after death. This meant that the town could be destroyed, but if someone carried the cult of the gods and the city's fire, then the city could go on and perhaps physically relocate somewhere else. Most cities in the Greco-Italian world had a founder which they revered and a foundation story they passed through generations. So, if we read the Aeneid, we may be disappointed that the story isn't necessarily about a blockbuster hero like Superman or Batman, but about the gods of Troy, who are relocating by using Aeneas as their instrument from Troy to Latium. In sum, the gods were the true runners of the show. A city-state, like a family, was a religious community with its own gods. To truly win over and conquer a city, one also had to win over its divine presence, its cult. Just like the gens, the city had its own sacred fire, also kept in a temple, known to the Romans as Vesta and to the Greeks as Prytanion. And just like in a family cult, no foreigner could participate in it. The gods of the city could be the ancestors of a noble family, a famous hero, or perhaps the founder himself. These gods could be acquired as if they were part of the city's assets. They were viewed as a fearful force who offered protection in exchange for sacrifice and reverence. The gods of nature, in the other hand, were known as deities and belonged to this national cult. We must imagine then how many thousands of names of deities and heroes are lost to us today. For many centuries, there were as many national gods, at least as much as many city-states there were. This national religion of the city exercised an absolute dominion over men, for it constituted the societies to which they belonged in body and soul. Its rituals and authority were present in private and public life, banquets, holidays, assemblies, senates, war, and peace. This civic religion was more about keeping old rites and practices unchanged, rather than debating or discussing doctrine. These rites were kept in annals, which were essentially books containing the city's historical record. These annals formed the basis of the city's history, a local secret history kept by the priests. Before Herodotus and Thucydides, this is how history was kept and recorded. The aristocratic assembly of the city's paterfamilias became a republican institution called the Senate, which discussed and legislated civic matters, met in a temple, as we know, of Athens and Rome, and every session was inaugurated with a religious act. The place generally had a sacred fire, continually burning. Every act of internal or external policy, every law, and every procedure had to be done according to the traditions set by religion, which completely dominated politics. In this early stage of city-states, we don't really see the democracies or tyrannies we usually think of when studying ancient Greece or Rome, but rather a priestly class who governed through the constitution of religion, which also ruled all aspects of private life. Nevertheless, things would not remain unchanged, and power struggles among different parties competing for power would eventually appear to wreak havoc on these fledgling states.
Feel free to donate to this channel's Patreon to support the making of these videos. We would receive any donation from our patrons and sponsors with plenty of gratefulness, as it truly aids with our enterprise of popularizing historical and philosophical topics to reinvigorate the study of the Western tradition. We also invite you to leave a comment below and like and share it if you enjoyed it. Stay tuned and subscribe!